The story begins not with a scream, nor with a headline, but with silence. A silence so thick it seemed to seep into the bones of a small American town, hidden deep in the Appalachian hollows. Most would call this place forgotten, but the people who lived here called it home. And it was in this isolation, beneath the weight of generations who never left, that the most unsettling of family secrets took root. A young woman was born into this quiet hell, a girl with eyes that seemed to see too much, and a family tree that twisted upon itself in ways that would make any outsider recoil. She was the kind of child you notice immediately, unnervingly bright, strangely quiet, and always watching, always calculating. But the eyes of the past do not merely watch, they remember, and they whisper. Her family, unknown to the world outside, carried a history of interwoven bloodlines. Cousins married cousins for generations, keeping their wealth, their land, their dark pride tightly sealed within the walls of their home. It was a lineage obsessed with purity, but the purity they sought was a distorted one, a shadowy echo of what normal families call normal. In the early years, there were warnings, but not the kind you'd hear in school or on the news. These were murmurs in church pews, sideways glances in the general store, and an unspoken fear that this girl's life would not be like anyone else's. The girl grew under their watchful eyes, molded not by love but by obligation, by a family that saw her as both a jewel and a secret. And then it began, subtle, almost invisible, the slow, horrifying pull toward one person, her brother, not just any brother, but the one who had shared every secret, every meal, every whispered story in the dead of night. In this town, history was alive, and it was waiting. The question was, who would dare confront it, and who would be swallowed by it? What happened next would not only fracture a family, but leave a scar across the countryside. A scar that whispered the truth about obsession, control, and the darkest corners of human desire. By the time outsiders would hear about this tale, it had already been buried under decades of shame, fear, and silence. Yet silence has a weight, and in this silence, the truth waits patiently, like a predator crouched just beyond the edge of perception. It is the kind of truth that makes you wonder whether curiosity is worth the price, the kind of story that refuses to let you sleep, that follows you into your dreams and waits there, patiently, for the moment you cannot look away. She was 16 when the first real signs appeared, though no one called them signs at the time. In a house built on secrecy, everything normal was distorted. Ordinary affection became something heavier, something that pressed too close and lingered too long. Neighbors would recall that the children were inseparable, their bond so intense it often seemed unnatural. They played together, learned together, and slept in rooms just doors apart. But there was a subtle tension underneath it all, a weight that made people glance away, that made them uneasy when the laughter between them rang too sharp, too familiar. Inside their home, however, the rules were different. Her father, a stern man who believed in keeping the bloodline pure, would not have imagined their closeness as anything unusual. To him, family loyalty was sacred, and any questioning of his authority or of his vision for the family was forbidden. But for the girl and for her brother, the line between love and possession blurred, twisted by years of isolation and the unspoken teachings of their elders. By the time she was 16, she had learned how to navigate the subtle rules of her family's hierarchy, what to say, what to withhold, and how to observe without being seen. Her brother had learned them too, and together they existed in a world apart from morality, a small world that understood only its own dark language. It was in this quiet, in the hallways of that ancient house, where the first dangerous experiment began, not out of cruelty, but out of curiosity, and perhaps a genetic compulsion neither fully understood. They tested boundaries, whispered questions they were told never to ask, and slowly, carefully, the familial veil of normality began to crack. Outside, the town continued, blissfully ignorant or unwilling to confront what thrived behind closed doors. But inside, there was a growing tension, a magnetic pull that the girl could not resist, and the brother could not deny. It was not overt at first. It began in glances, in touches that lingered longer than friendship demanded, in moments that felt charged with an invisible energy. Every interaction drew them closer. Every shared secret strengthened the invisible bond that tied them together. They were learning something ancient, something forbidden, a connection written in the very strands of their DNA. And as the seasons changed, as the leaves fell, and the winter winds crept through the hollows, that bond did not break. It deepened, becoming something the family could neither name nor control. And the girl, the one whose eyes always seemed to see too much, began to understand the power she held, and the horror it might unleash. Every whispered night, every glance in the dim light of the candle, every step toward the unthinkable was a choice. And in the hollows of America, choices are not always free. By the time she turned 18, the unthinkable had become a quiet inevitability. The family, already steeped in secrecy and compulsion, had normalized the abnormal, and the boundaries that most people consider inviolable were no longer meaningful. In the dim glow of their ancestral home, the girl and her brother became prisoners of a twisted inheritance, an inheritance written not in land deeds or bank accounts, but in blood. They moved together through the days like shadows, careful to hide what the rest of the family could sense but not name. And yet, the family watched anyway. The parents, weighed down by their own complicity and the unrelenting desire to protect their version of purity, said nothing, choosing silence over confrontation. In this world, silence was both a shield and a weapon. No one dared challenge what they had allowed to fester. Outside, the small town remained oblivious. The general store, the school, the church, they all continued as if nothing extraordinary had taken root in the old house perched on the hillside. But inside, every glance, every accidental brush of a hand, every whispered conversation held a hidden meaning. Their bond, already unnatural, began to crystallize into something irreversible. They were no longer siblings in the sense the world understood. They were entangled in a pattern older than themselves, a repetition of a dark legacy that had quietly threaded through generations. It was as though they were acting out a story written long before they were born, a story that no one outside could comprehend, and one they themselves could not fully articulate. And yet, within them, there was a constant tension, a mixture of fear, desire, and curiosity that pushed them forward. The girl, once quiet and observant, now carried a weight behind her eyes, a knowledge that she could not share. Her brother mirrored her, equally trapped, equally complicit, equally drawn to the same forbidden horizon. They knew the world would never understand them, it could not, and in that understanding, or lack of it, they found a perverse solace. For a time they existed in this private hell, a chamber of forbidden intimacy, never speaking the full truth, yet living it in every glance and every secret touch. And as their lives twisted ever closer together, the family's foundations began to tremble under the strain. Something had awakened in the house, something that would not be satisfied by mere silence. It was watching, waiting, and when the inevitable finally came, when their parents' complicity could no longer contain it, the town would have to reckon with a truth it was never prepared to see. The truth did not announce itself with a bang. It crept forward in whispers, in the way the girl and her brother moved through the house with a careful synchronicity, in the faint scent of something unspoken hanging in the air. Their parents, now older and wearied by years of maintaining appearances, sensed the inevitable, but they did not intervene. Perhaps they believed it was impossible to stop what had been brewing for so long. Perhaps they feared that naming it aloud would unleash a horror they could no longer control, and so the house became a chamber of quiet obsession, each day a repetition of the last, each night a continuation of a cycle that had no rules outside of its own. Neighbors began to notice subtle changes in the children. There were no scandalous rumors, no public accusations, only a sense that something was off. The way the siblings sometimes looked at each other, too long, too knowing, left an indelible impression on those who caught it. And yet, no one dared confront the family directly. There is a certain terror in proximity to secrets too dark to name. Inside the walls of that house, the girl and her brother reached the point where hesitation no longer existed. What had once been hidden, whispered, or imagined, now became deliberate. The bond, impossible and unnatural, solidified into action, and when it did, the consequences rippled outward like a stone thrown into a still pond. Their parents were forced to reckon with what they had enabled, but it was too late. The bloodline, which they had tried to preserve in isolation, had now crossed a line that society could not forgive. And yet, the siblings themselves felt no shame, not in the way the world would define it. Their world was private, insulated, and distorted. In this microcosm, they believed they were protecting something sacred, something only they could understand. The air inside the house became heavy with the weight of secrecy, with the knowledge that they had rewritten the rules of family and morality in their own image. Outside, the town remained oblivious, continuing its slow rhythm, its own darkness muted compared to the horrors that festered behind closed doors. But for the girl and her brother, there was no turning back. The past, with all its twisted traditions and intergenerational obsessions, had caught up to them. And in that quiet, terrifying inevitability, the story of the most inbred sister who married her own brother became not a scandal whispered in fear, but a legacy of silence, shame, and something far more primal, something that would haunt the hollows for generations to come. By the time the town finally caught wind of the family's secret, it was too late to untangle the damage that had been done. Whispers began to circulate, small at first, like smoke curling from a distant fire, growing louder as curiosity overcame fear. People spoke of the house on the hill in hushed tones, never daring to approach directly, yet unable to ignore the sense of unease it carried. Those who knew the family's lineage, those who had lived alongside them for generations, spoke of patterns repeating themselves, cycles of obsession and isolation that were impossible to break. And in those whispers, the siblings' actions became a story that was both horrifying and strangely magnetic, the kind of tale people retell when they want to remind themselves of the fragile line between normality and madness. The girl, once just an observer of the darkness around her, had now become its central figure. Her brother, equally ensnared, moved in lockstep with her, the two of them bound together by a force no one outside their world could comprehend. It was here, in this small town, that the psychological horror of their lives began to spill into reality. Neighbors reported a sense of being watched, of the family's presence lingering long after they had left the room. There were rumors of rituals, of secret meetings late at night, and of behaviors that defied comprehension. Some tried to intervene, but the family's isolation and tight control made outsiders powerless. The siblings had created a private universe, one in which their choices, terrifying and unnatural, were justified by the rules they had internalized from childhood. And yet, even as the world began to whisper its judgment, there was an undeniable, creeping fascination. People wanted to understand, to see the inner workings of a lineage that had taken itself so far beyond the bounds of normal life. It was the kind of story that lingers in your mind long after it's heard, the kind that makes you question what you would do if placed in similar circumstances, if the weight of blood and legacy pressed down upon you. If you're still watching, you're already braver than most. Tell us in the comments, what would you have done if this was your bloodline? Because for this family, there was no choice. There was only the inexorable pull of history, of obsession, of secrets too tightly bound to ever be undone. And the question that remains, long after the town has whispered and the siblings have disappeared into their private history, is whether anyone who steps too close to such darkness can ever return unchanged. Even decades later, the house on the hill remained a monument to what had transpired. Inside its walls, the paint peeled, the windows clouded with dust, and the air around it carried a weight that seemed almost tangible. Locals who passed by spoke of chills, of hearing faint murmurs at night, as if the house itself remembered the acts committed within. The girl and her brother were gone, married, yes, but vanished into obscurity, leaving behind only the echoes of their transgression. And yet, their story did not vanish. It lingered in family whispers, in journals and letters that never left the attic, in the quiet shame of distant cousins who carried the knowledge like a hidden scar. Historians would later describe such lineages in clinical terms: a consanguinity, genetic risk, familial isolation, but the reality was far more haunting than any textbook could convey. In those walls, love, obsession, and compulsion had merged into something grotesque, leaving behind a psychological residue that would haunt anyone who dared to investigate too closely. For the siblings, the consequences of their actions were never fully public, but they were all-encompassing. They were trapped by their own choices, bound together in a world of their own creation, where the outside rules no longer mattered. Their lives became a study in contradiction, intimately intertwined yet isolated from all others, powerful yet powerless, free yet imprisoned by the very blood that sustained them. And perhaps most chillingly, their story serves as a reminder that some truths, no matter how deeply buried, have a way of asserting themselves. The past, like the house, refuses to remain silent. It waits patiently, whispering in the corners, in the attics, in the memories of those who remember. Those who dare to look too closely into the shadows of such families often find themselves unsettled, unable to dismiss the quiet horror that lurks in plain sight. And as the decades pass, the story of the girl and her brother transforms from rumor to legend, a cautionary tale of isolation, obsession, and the dark, inexorable pull of blood. In the hollows of America, the past is never truly gone. It is only waiting, watching, and sometimes, when the wind blows just right, whispering the secrets it was never meant for the world to hear. The final chapter of their story is less about what was done and more about what lingers, the unseen weight of their choices, the way a single family obsession can ripple through generations. The girl and her brother disappeared from public view, but their legacy remained. Children born in distant states carried fragments of that bloodline, unaware of the secrets encoded into their DNA, a quiet inheritance of isolation and compulsion. The house on the hill fell further into decay, but the air around it never forgot. Locals claim that even now, the faint sound of whispers drifts from the crumbling walls, as if the building itself remembers what happened within. Scholars and true crime researchers who have uncovered parts of the story describe it as a perfect storm of genetics, environment, and secrecy. A chilling reminder that horror does not always arrive with violence or spectacle. Sometimes it exists in the quiet pull of obsession, in the choices we make when no one else is watching, in the bonds we cannot untangle, even when we desperately try. The siblings' story is one of forbidden love, yes, but it is also a story of inherited darkness, of isolation taken to an extreme, of a family's refusal or inability to confront its own history. In the hollows, the truth of their lives lingers like smoke, intangible, unsettling, impossible to erase. And the most haunting question remains: how far would any of us go to protect our own blood, to maintain a lineage that history might otherwise condemn? Perhaps we will never know, because most of us are spared such choices. But the house on the hill and the family who lived and loved within it serve as a chilling testament to what happens when human desire and history collide in isolation. In the end, the past is not merely a record of events. It is a force, patient and relentless, that shapes the living and the forgotten alike. And if you ever find yourself near the hollows, listening too closely, you may hear it, the quiet, unyielding murmur of a family secret too dark to ever fully die.